Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with Professor Joe Vukov. Joe's a professor at Loyola University Chicago. We got to sit down with Joe out in Waco, Texas at Baylor University. The Institute for Faith and Learning had us come out and join them, taping a lot of interviews, one of which was a live plenary event with Ross Picard that you can listen to on another episode. But with Joe, we got to sit down in the studio and talk about moral philosophy and tech. Joe's a professor of philosophy, and so he thinks a great deal about what does it mean to live a good life. And yet he's also done a lot of work thinking about technology. A conversation with all of the folks out there at Baylor was just really fascinating, and this one as well with Joe. A lot of very helpful ways of taking what can be very arcane topics or seem arcane topics from the outside and make them very understandable and highly relevant. And so a lovely conversation with Joe. So here's Joe Vukov talking about AI, tech, and moral philosophy. Enjoy. Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. There is, as you may have noticed, no shortage of content in the world. Opinions, endless, outrage, plentiful. Deep wisdom and thoughtful perspective, slightly harder to come by. That's part of why we created the NSC Notebook. It's our weekly email from the world of No Small Endeavor with reflections on a good life, behind-the-scenes insight into our interviews, and quotes that stuck with me long after those conversations ended. You'll also get a curated list of what I'm reading, watching, and listening to, books, movies, music, and other things I think are actually worth your time. It comes to your inbox every Tuesday, completely free. So if you'd like one less thing to doom scroll and one more thing to actually enjoy, sign up for the NSC Notebook at nosmallendeavor.com.
Hi, friends. It's Annie F. Downs here, and I am so beyond excited to share with you that I have a brand new TV show called I Gotta Ask that begins airing Thursday, May 28th on The Wonder Project, which you can find through your Amazon Prime Video app. You may have heard of The Wonder Project because they're the ones who brought you The House of David, and I am so honored and honestly have zero chill that I get to partner with them to make this dream come true. I love how Wonder Project is not only creating great original TV and movies that audiences can experience together, but also curating content via their subscription on Prime Video filled with meaningful stories. The first 2 episodes of my talk show, I Gotta Ask, premiere on May 28th, followed by 2 episodes each on June 4th and June 11th. In every episode, I sit down with a group of friends, some experts in their fields and some thought leaders, some just my real life people. And we talk about things like, why is dating so hard in 2026? Or how do I build a business? What do I do with fear and anxiety? And so many more questions that I just had to ask. I cannot wait to hear what you think. You can subscribe today at igottaask.com.
Joe Vukov is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Loyola University Chicago, where he works at the intersection of ethics, human dignity, technology, science, and religion. He's the author of several books, including Staying Human in an Era of Artificial Intelligence. Joe is also an award-winning teacher and also serves as president of Philosophers in Jesuit Education. And we both find ourselves today, thanks to the Institute for Faith and Learning at Baylor University, face-to-face here in Waco, Texas.
It's great to be here.
It is great to be here, Joe. Nice to see you.
It's good to see you, too.
Thanks for sitting down and talking to us.
Of course. I'm glad we could do this in person.
Yeah, me too. Which we'll talk about being in person
in
a moment. And the importance of...
It's a relevant observation.
Yes, that's right, of bodily engagement.
Absolutely.
So take us through the Turing test. This is a kind of a classic computer science sort of story, but it certainly relates to a lot of the philosophical work you've done. So what is the Turing test?
Yeah, so the Turing test, we call it the Turing test because it's due to this guy, Alan Turing. You might have seen the Benedict Cumberbatch movie a few years back. Now I'm forgetting what the name was, but he did a movie about life of Alan Turing. He's basically the father of computer science. So a really important figure in the history of computer science, and also particularly important in philosophy for this thing he came up with called the Turing test. And roughly what the Turing test is it's a test to try and figure out whether or not machines can think. And the way he puts it is not whether they're actually thinking, but something like as good as being thinking. And there's a few layers in which you can talk about the Turing test, but the rough idea is that you get a computer And if the computer can respond to a human in a way that's indistinguishable from the way a human would respond to another human, then he says, well, that's just as good as thinking. I mean, we can go a little bit more specific here. So the way he sets it up is he says, I want first to do a test where, let's say, Lee, I want you to pretend you're an occupation that you're not. Right. So maybe you're a lawyer or something like that. And we're going to have a conversation and we're going to see at what rate you can trick somebody into thinking that you're something that you're not. Right. So it's not going to be 100% of the time. We don't know each other that well. So I don't know how good of a storyteller you are, but maybe you get it right. 75% of the time.
Well, the first time I tried a case, it was in 1994.
I'm convinced. Yeah. There it is. Right. So, right. It sort of depends on how good you are at this, but it's not going to be 100% hardly ever. Yeah. But maybe 70% of the time you trick somebody. Okay, so that's sort of your baseline is here's how often a human being can trick somebody into being something that they're not. Then he says, now what we're going to do is we're going to have a computer or an AI pretend like it's human. And it's not that when you're interacting with it, and again, like this is where it's wild because it's basically kind of like interacting with ChatGPT at this point, and says that now it's not that it has to trick you 100% of the time, right? And like every conversation you have, you say, I can't tell if this is a human or not. You have to suppose here that you don't know you're interacting with ChatGPT. So it's not 100% of the time because that's higher than we would set the standard for humans. Rather, we say as long as the computer can trick us into thinking it's human at the same rate that you could trick me into thinking you're a lawyer. So again, let's set that at like 70%. If it's simulating a human talking at least 70% of the time, then Turing says that's just as good as saying that the computer itself is thinking.
So it's the technical term, I guess, for this is it's a functionalist definition.
Yeah, it's functionalist.
Yeah.
Yeah. So kind of what a functionalist approach to mind roughly says that one tagline that you'll hear functionalists say sometimes is that the mind is what the brain does. So roughly it's that what's most important to the human mind, and by extension, what's most important to us as humans, is the ways in which we carry out functions. And specifically, a lot of times this is cashed out in computational terms. So the way in which inputs are correlated with outputs. And that's the defining feature of the human mind. So take human mind in general or also specific cognitive features. So what does it mean for a human to believe something? Well, it means that if I believe in God, I'm going to take certain inputs. If somebody asks me, do you believe in God? I'll say, yes, I believe in God, right? So that it's the correlation of inputs and outputs is not just a feature of psychological life, it's the defining aspect of psychological.
For the functionalist.
For the functionalist,
yeah. So philosopher John Searle comes along and he doesn't like the Turing test.
He does not.
Yeah. Describe for us his competing accounts.
Yeah, so I'll give you Searle's account with a little bit of extra flourish to it, right? So the way I like to talk about this is suppose that you get this job, and it's a very strange job. You're assigned to this room, kind of like actually the room we're sitting in right now, sort of a black box or a white box, and your job is that on one end of the room, there's an input slot. So you can kind of imagine the old-timey mail system, right, where there's in slot, right? And every once in a while, this sheet of paper comes into the in slot. And your job is you take the sheet of paper and you look on it and it's just a whole bunch of squiggles. But you know your job. Your job is on one wall, you can kind of imagine you're facing this wall, is this gigantic flow chart. And on the flow chart, it's got all these squiggles depicted. And your job, you don't know what the purpose of this is. You don't know exactly what you're doing. All you know is that you've been told during orientation to this new gig is that you look, you find the squiggle on that flow chart, and it will tell you if you get this squiggly flow chart, then you go to this pile of other sheets of paper and you look below you. And what do you know? There's this pile of other sheets of paper and you find this other squiggle and you grab that sheet of paper and that goes out the out slot, right? This flow chart's pretty complicated. So sometimes you get a squiggle and it'll tell you if you get this one, you push this other one out. Other times it will say, oh, you get this squiggle, you can choose between 2 or 3 of these other ones and you put it out on the out slot. Now let's say that the benefits of this job are really good. So you stick around, you do it for your whole career. You're 50 years in. At this point, you've basically memorized the flow chart. Sounds like a pretty horrific job in many ways, but at this point, you've basically memorized the flow chart, right? So that you get one of these things in the in slot, you don't even have to look. You know exactly which squiggly paper you grab it, you throw it out the out slot. Here's the twist. What you don't know, and this is why it's important that these are squiggles, is that what they actually were was not merely random squiggles. They were actually Chinese characters, right? So it's important that this is Chinese. It's a pictorial language, because you couldn't look and see like, oh, there's letters here. You had no idea. They just kind of look like squiggles on paper. It turns out that they were actually pictorial writing, and this was Chinese writing that was coming into you. What the flowchart was in turn was a depiction of how Mandarin works. So it says, oh, if somebody sends you in a sheet of paper that says, how are you? You can say, I'm fine, or maybe, I've had better days. Maybe there's some options that you can have, but that's what the flowchart's depicting. And then of course, these slips of paper on the ground that you're sending out are the responses that you can give to what's being said to you on the way in. Now, here's what this has to do with functionalism. I realized that was a little bit of a long story. What Searle wants to argue is that at this point, you are functionally identical to a native Chinese speaker. Again, kind of go back. You've internalized the flowchart. Somebody sends you in a sheet of paper. You know exactly what sheet of paper to reply with. So you process inputs and outputs identically to somebody who's a native Mandarin speaker. But of course, built into the whole thought experiment is you don't know Mandarin. Right? You don't even know what task you're completing. So according to Searle, that's a big problem with functionalism, and that it's missing is that, and it's interesting that it doesn't necessarily even pinpoint exactly what functionalism misses. It just points out that the human mind, human psychological life has to be something more than just processing inputs and outputs.
So how does this kind of observation by Searle inform your own assessment of where we stand at the moment with AI and large language models?
Yeah, so I think it points out the limitations of large language models and AIs. I don't think it gives you a positive vision of what the human being is. So I don't think it says, here's the way we need to flesh out this story to get at what it means to be a human, what it means to have psychological life. But I think what it does is it points out that if we think about AI as capturing completely human psychological life because it can function a lot like a human, maybe even functions in certain ways better than a human. It can process things faster. It can maybe be more eloquent in the way it puts something. And I think the Chinese room, what it does is it puts its finger on and says, that's a part of human psychological life. I think it's really hard to disagree that part of what we do with our minds is process inputs and give out output. There's sort of a computational profile to the human mind. But it points out that what an LLM is doing can't be the full picture. There has to be something else. So for me, it's really a starting point. Again, it's not sort of saying, and here's what human psychological life really is, and here's what a human really is. But it's pointing out, well, it can't just be that. There has to be something more. Yeah. And then that pushes us to think more about, well, what else is there? How do we fill in the gaps?
So I guess one way to put that would be that if you take Alan Turing's test as giving us a sufficient definition of intelligence, say, then we've really reduced what human intelligence actually is. It's much more complicated, and in some various ways, it's much more than that. And that's a too reductive account of what it would mean to be intelligent.
Exactly. Yeah, that's my take exactly. Yeah, that it really, the Chinese room really points out the way in which, if you're thinking about AI as capturing all of human intelligence, you're already thinking about it too reductively.
Yeah. Philosophical zombies.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, good. So it's sort of a different kind of argument.
Yeah.
So a philosophical zombie it's this thought experiment. A few people have talked about it. This guy, David Chalmers, is probably the one who's made it most popular. And here's the idea. It's another way of kind of getting at some of the limitations of functionalism. So it's a nice partner with the Chinese room. And the way this works is to say that right now we're having this interaction, we're having this conversation. And I know that you are responding to me. We're doing the things that sort of humans do. And I know that as we're doing this, that the lights, so to speak, are on upstairs for me. I know not only that we're having this conversation, but that I'm not merely an automaton.
Yeah.
I know I'm not a robot, put it that way.
Yeah.
I know there's something going on upstairs. The idea of philosophical zombie says, I don't know that about Lee. Right. I can strongly suspect it. I can infer it. I can guess that it's probable. But I don't know whether or not there's lights on upstairs, so to speak. I don't know if there's something that it's like to be you.
Yeah.
So again, it's not that I don't know if you're not a robot. I can check. I can confirm that you're not a robot. But I can't confirm what's going on upstairs. I can't confirm whether there's something that it's like to be you. What this means is philosophical zombies are kind of boring zombies, right? So I actually really like watching zombie movies and zombie shows. Those are entertaining zombies. A philosophical zombie is exactly the idea of someone who functionally acts just like a human being, but there's nothing that it's like to be them. There's no consciousness. There's no inner life. And the very possibility of philosophical zombies. So you don't have to think there's actual philosophical zombies out there. Even if you admit that there's a 1%, a 0.01% chance that somebody could act just like a human being without having any sort of interior life, as soon as you allow that in the door, it's another way of pointing out that a functional characterization of human beings and a functional characterization of psychological life just can't be the whole story. There has to be something extra to account for human inner psychological life. Yeah. So it's kind of a nice partner that gets at the same point as the Chinese room, but in a different way. Both of them are really trying to get to this idea that a functional approach to humans is overly reductive. Yeah. And even while it might capture part of human life and part of human psychology, it's not giving you the full picture.
Yeah. So related to this, the fact that large language models are functional, by definition, I guess, that a lot of people are pointing out that means then that large language models are much more concerned with giving responses that sound plausible as opposed to being necessarily truthful or necessarily meaningful.
Yeah, exactly. So I work in sort of the Catholic philosophical moral tradition. And there's a great document that came out of the Vatican last year. It's called Antiqua et Nova. And I'd recommend it to anyone, even outside of the Catholic tradition. It's a really phenomenal document. And one thing that it does really well is it kind of gets at a lot of the points we've been talking about in a less philosophical and more theological, big picture anthropological way. And the entire first half of the document, what it does is it looks at artificial intelligence, contrasting that with human intelligence, and looks at a full picture of human intelligence, all these different aspects of human intelligence that the artificial variety simply misses. And one of the ones it leans into is exactly the one that you were just mentioning. The way it talks about it is human intelligence is oriented towards the truth. We care about the truth. We care about getting things right. We care about meaning. And that's something that AI just doesn't try to do. It might practically try to get things right because it's good for AI to tell you true information, but it doesn't care about that. And it doesn't care about the meaning of getting to the truth. There's a whole lot of other things it discusses too. This document talks about the relational aspect of human intelligence, the orientation to truth of human intelligence. There's all these different aspects of human intelligence that when you really start thinking about who we are as human beings from a philosophical, let alone theological perspective, I think it becomes clear fairly quickly, actually, that human intelligence is something much more robust than the artificial variety. Yeah.
So talk to us a little bit about the way disordered desire plays into all this, in the sense that if a large language model is being trained upon as much human language as it can acquire, and that corpus of human language represents the desires of humankind, or at least the select population from which this language, canon of language represents a group of people, human beings, then in what ways from a Catholic tradition, is disordered desire going to affect the functions there of what's going to come out?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's a really crucial point that I think is missed by a lot of people. But as soon as you bring it in the open, it becomes, I think the Christian Catholic perspective is helpful here. But I think that even if you don't have that, it becomes obvious this is a problem. Because of course, AIs are trained on human created data. That's just how they work. How do you create an LLM? You have to give it lots and lots of text, Wikipedia and ebooks and social media posts and all this stuff. But of course, humans are fallen, and the things we do are fallen. The data we produce are fallen. They're full of bias. They're full of disordered desire. They're full of just getting things wrong, whether intentionally or not. And because any AI is built on fallen human data, anything that it does, the thing that it becomes, is ultimately going to be built on that problematic stuff. And therefore, anything that it's producing is also going to be a function of how it was made. That doesn't mean that it's always going to be disordered, that it's always going to get things wrong. But I think it is really important to realize the building materials of AI, right? It's sort of, what are we building this thing out of? And we're building it from things that are the result of our thinking and our desires and our interactions online and our publications. And again, I think that this is heightened if you have a Christian anthropology and you understand humans beings to be fallen. But even stepping outside of that anthropology, it's pretty clear that humans don't produce flawless data. Right? We have biases, we have disordered desires. So it's kind of a version of the old garbage in, garbage out principle, or you can only make something as strong as the materials that you're using. And AI is built with human data, so it's only going to be ever so strong.
Are you familiar with the work of Shannon Valor?
A little bit.
Yeah, she's making the case in this recent book, The AI Mirror, that one helpful way to think about what's happening with these models is it is simply a mirror back to us. And it's going to mirror back to us some things that are beautiful and some things that are very ugly. And that it lacks imagination, it lacks reflection, it lacks meditation. But that seems to be, certainly because of all the things you were just saying, really problematic.
It is. It is. Yeah, I think that's a great metaphor too, is that, it's going to be, and it is interesting because some of the ways here that AI can work and how biases and disordered desires can emerge is that it's not just a mirror, but sometimes it's a carnival mirror where it takes realities and then expands them in certain ways. So this will happen when you're trying to build an AI and there's some kind of bias or problem that's implicit in the data that you may not have noticed initially. So I'll give you an example. Is the story, I think this is true. If it's not, it's a good story, whether or not it's true or not. And it indicates the sort of thing that I'm trying to get at, is that suppose you're a hospital system and building an AI to help you go through all your records, right? Now, presumably, your records here are not going to be as problematically, assuming that you've got good faith practitioners and stuff, you're not going to have these like explicit biases and false information and disordered desires in your hospital records in the same way, at least, that you are if you're like combing Reddit and grabbing stuff from there. Right. So you're using data that you would think this is pretty clean. It's going to be not as subject to human fallenness as just grabbing stuff off the internet. But here's the problem. And again, this is where I think this is a true story, that at least one time what happened in building these systems is that they found out that the AI was starting to triage people, not based, or to comb through records, not based on anything to do with medical diagnosis, but was rather picking up on the zip codes. Because what turned out is that, and this is not particularly surprising, is that people in the hospital system had received slightly different care based on the zip codes they were coming from, right? Who's got better insurance, who's got more money, who has more social privilege and status, that was correlated in a completely unintentional way, right? We can presume goodwill on the part of the hospital system, but sort of unknowingly, there was this problem in the data set that you didn't pick up on until you put it all together, but the AI did pick up on it and said, oh, people from this zip code tend to receive different kind of care than people from this zip code. So that must be a thing. And we need to divide these patients out, which is obviously problematic. Obviously, you have to go back and fix that. What's that doing, though? It's holding up a mirror to our humanity. But it's interesting that it's almost like a makeup mirror, right? Where it's like, here's this part of our humanity that was almost maybe not impossible, but it would be very difficult to pick that up. Whereas you run that through an AI and at a mass scale, all of a sudden it's amplifying this bias, this problem that you wouldn't have noticed otherwise. So it's a mirror, but it's an amplifying mirror.
That seems crucial to me because the idea here is that you have some sort of structural injustice and the AI in this case is not merely propagating it, but amplifying it.
Exactly.
Yeah, because it's getting it out there more quickly. And spreading it through the system.
Exactly, which in some ways is maybe helpful. Obviously, it's not helpful to then use that system.
Yeah.
But in the same way that a carnival mirror can be helpful to say like, oh, like, I don't know, I'm looking at my face a little more closely, getting ready for the day. And I don't, I need to, the sunscreen's not quite rubbed in yet. I should probably do that. Right. Is that the AI is capable of letting us see something in a structural pattern of behavior or a way that we're engaging with the world that you just might not have known. I mean, think about how hard it would be if you're a hospital administrator. You wouldn't even think to look at zip codes.
Right.
But then even if you did, I mean, you could probably do it, but that would be a giant amount of resources and time to figure out, are we treating people differently based on zip code, where an AI can do it like that.
Right. And it's very, very good at that.
It is very good at
looking for patterns that we have not yet seen, or maybe in some cases cannot even see.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. And I think that's part of it. And part of what's incredible about AI is that I think that will and can already do things, recognize patterns that we can't. I think it's also one reason why we need to take care with it is that we might have thought, for instance, that those hospital records were totally unbiased, but it turns out that if we weren't careful about it and applying a system in a hospital system, then all of a sudden we're exacerbating problems that were already there.
So a corollary to this bias amplification would be that AI models are not simply reporting things to us that we then can choose to do with as we will, but that they are also shaping the way we think.
Absolutely. Yeah. And this is one of my biggest concerns with AI. And I think it's a concern that we're already more familiar with, I think, than we would initially think. And it comes from things like the kind of predictive, more simpler AI that are present on sites like Amazon, right? Is that, and I think we've probably all had this, where as the Amazon algorithm starts to pick up on your preferences. So I buy a lot of books. I probably shouldn't, but I buy lots and lots of books from Amazon.
Me both.
Yeah. And as you continue shopping on Amazon, initially it starts picking up on your preferences. Oh, Joe's back, right? Here's what Joe's going to like to buy. But then you notice that the algorithm actually starts shaping your preferences too, right? So it's not just, oh, you read this book by this author. This author has another new book out. You'll probably like that. But it's, no, here's an adjacent author that you might not have thought to read. But the algorithm says people that, and I mean, literally says this, people who bought
like
this book also like this. And you follow that.
Yeah.
So what happens is that incrementally, your desires are being shaped, not only directed by, but being shaped by the algorithm. And all of a sudden, I'm reading a book 4 or 5 steps away from that initial one. And now all of a sudden, those are the kinds of books that I like. I think that actually is already really concerning, because what's happening is that we're allowing our, in this case, reading preferences, bigger picture, our agency, our desires, what we're learning, what we're loving. And those are being shaped not only by my choosing, obviously there's choice involved as well, but my agency has been diminished. I think that this gets amplified when we look at larger generative kinds of AIs as well. An example of this is I had a colleague who was telling me, so in higher education, everyone's talking about how do we do education with AI. And he had an observation that I thought was particularly disturbing along these lines, where he said, I'm starting to get essays that I know are not written by ChatGPT. I don't know what he's got in place. Maybe these are like blue books, or I know they're not written by ChatGPT, but they read like they are. So what's happened is that our understanding of what a well-written essay is being formed by ChatGPT. So the initial phase was, I'm going to use it to write my essays.
Yeah.
Already problematic. To me, I think the even deeper problem is where our imagination and our understanding and our desires and how we think about what an essay is, think about what I want to read, think about all these different places where algorithms have an influence on our lives. And those are, again, not just being guided by or completing tasks by us, but they're actually shaping how we understand and view the world to begin with.
What about standards of truth in these models? So, I mean, at some point, there have to be some difficult decisions about deciding what an algorithm's going to tell you about A, B, or C. Yeah. And I would assume at some point, some of these companies have to make decisions about what they're going to prioritize. So what are you seeing about that, and what's standing out to you in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the best examples here is you can try this. If you ask ChatGPT, or I'm guessing any of the models, a question about ethics, it will give you the most milquetoast neutral answer you could possibly get, right? It will almost always start out with something like, what you've asked is a very difficult ethical question, and there is much disagreement about it. And then,
which is true to the Guild of Ethics.
Which is true. Yeah. And here's the way some people answer it. Here's the way other people answer it. So there have been decisions already made that neutrality is the appropriate kind of response, as neutral as possible is the appropriate kind of response for ethical questions. But of course, a neutral stance is a stance.
Right.
And you can see why you would do this for the sake of not wanting to appear biased, and for the sake of litigation, right? You don't want your chatbot to be promoting one particular, you might think that you're setting yourself up for a lawsuit depending on what it's spouting. Or again, at the very least, you'd say, I'm not using this tool because it's always leaning left, always leaning right. But of course, neutrality itself is an ethical position. So again, there's reasons for it. I can see why you would say this is the kind of answers we want you to give. But at the same time, it's sort of reinforcing the idea that neutrality is a appropriate ethical stance to issues in which neutrality is not the appropriate ethical stance. What the right stance is an important debate. We could think about the ethics of I work in bioethics. So, the ethics of physician-assisted suicide or something that's very high stakes where it's really clear that the right stance here is not neutral, right? It's either this is something very problematic or this is something that is acceptable. So by programming in neutrality, it sort of feeds into this idea that ethics actually isn't all that important.
Yeah.
And that neutrality it's okay to just say, no, I'm neutral. I don't know what to think. So no, you really should think something about this.
Which is a deeply formative way to go about it.
It's a deeply formative way to go about it.
Right. Anything else on any of the functionalism or any of these things that we haven't mentioned yet before we turn to Gnosticism?
No, I don't think so. I think that what I would say is that I think this is very big picture, less argumentative, is that I think that the very fact that we have to have the functionalist conversation and the fact that we sort of don't notice right away that what an LLM is doing is not fully fleshed out human intelligence is an indicator that we're already thinking about ourselves in reductive ways. We already think about ourselves computationally, sort of implicitly. And that's why when a computer can replicate us, we start freaking out and thinking, oh no, it does all the things that I can do.
Yeah.
So I would say in some ways, the moment we're in right now is a very helpful diagnostic moment for implicit assumptions and ways of understanding anthropology that we've taken on board. So I think it's a good moment for self-correction, for us to realize that, oh wait, I've been thinking about other human beings and myself in really functional, reductive ways already.
Yeah.
And I need to go back and make my view of myself and other humans much more robust.
Right. Hey, friends, one of the things we've learned from listeners is that many of you don't want to just listen to these conversations. You'd like to go deeper than that. That's part of why we created NSC Plus, which is our subscriber community, where we share additional conversations, reflections, and bonus material connected to the themes of the show, especially looking for ways that this can relate to the practice of your own life. Recently, we started a new series called Reflections on a Good Life, in which I share brief reflections arising from some of our favorite NSC interviews. You might think of it as a weekly 7-minute episode in which I pull out some pearl of wisdom from an interview and suggest a question on which you might choose to meditate to further cultivate some goodness in your own life. We've also launched a new bonus series called Books You Should Know. In the first installment, I sat down with Dr. Lee Warren for a conversation that quickly became one of my favorite interviews I've done in quite a while. It's all waiting for you over at NSC Plus. And just as importantly, NSC Plus is what helps keep No Small Endeavor on the air and available for free to everyone. Subscriptions start at just $5 a month, and if these conversations have been meaningful to you, we would truly love to have you join us. You can learn more at nosmallendeavor.com or click the link in the show notes and join NSC Plus.
Study and play come together on a Windows 11 PC. And for a limited time, college students get the best of both worlds. Get the Unreal College Deal. Everything you need to study and play with select Windows 11 PCs. Eligible students get a year of Microsoft 365 Premium and a year of Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with a custom color Xbox wireless controller. Learn more at windows.com/student offer. While supplies last. Ends June 30th. Terms at aka.ms/collegepc.
Blowing ad budget on metrics that look great till the CFO sees them. That's bull spend. And marketers are calling it out in Dashboard Confessions.
I remember telling my boss, it'll be good for the brand, when leads were slow. Yeah, it wasn't.
Cut the bull spend. LinkedIn lets you target by company, job title, and more. Advertise on LinkedIn. Spend $250 on your first campaign and get a $250 credit. Go to linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply.
Let me ask one more question about kind of this functionalist approach. So if the large language models are trying to give us or do give us what's most statistically probable, unless we ask for something otherwise, right? And so it's trying to find something there in the bell curve that's going to be most probable and plausible.
Mm-hmm.
And now we have increasingly language and deployment of these tools that, as some are saying, we're moving from the attention economy to the attachment economy, where they're wanting to use other neural pathways, like not just dopamine in the sort of fear-mongering or anger world, right? But also serotonin or the endogenous opioids and dopamine, all of the very, very strong neural pathway to attach to us emotionally, and then being done for monetary purposes, for profitable purposes. But it seems to me that the language that I don't think we are sufficiently finding a way to use yet around that is that it's ultimately deceptive. It seems to me that if I were to realize, say, that a friend whom I thought was a friend responds to me in apparently caring ways or emotionally appropriate ways, and then I find out, they don't care at all, right? I would feel deeply betrayed. But we're engaging with some of these AI tools, and they talk to us in subjective language, and then second person language of you, and it use kind of sometimes even first person language for itself, and then this sort of attachment that's beginning to happen. It seems just deeply deceptive. But I don't know. How do you think about that?
I'm the exact same page, Lee. I think that the problem, even with the attention economy, is where it starts to become disturbing to us is where we don't have transparency, right? Is where we sort of don't realize the ways in which our attention is getting taken from us and being monetized and corporatized, which I think is the information is out there. And with a little bit of reflection, we can know sort of why it's so hard to resist doom scrolling on Instagram, is that there's a lot of effort spent on making sure that your attention is locked in. And I think that's what disturbs us though about the attention economy is when we realize, oh wait, but like we aren't fully aware of all the money and all the R&D and everything that's going into keeping me scrolling on my phone.
The so-called neural marketing.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that you're exactly right that with the attachment economy, you're ramping that up even more, because I think that it's even less transparent that what I'm doing when I'm forming attachments is just a simulation of the real thing. But it's so easy to slip into thinking that because it feels like the real thing. It seems like the real thing, right? Is that it seems like this real genuine interaction. And there's this sort of non-transparent, and this isn't, I'm not making the point so much about transparency of the companies. It's more about the lack of transparency in the experience, right? It's sort of your example with the friend who's just like, it's something getting close to that where I'm having this interaction, and in having the interaction, it's so easy to lose sight of the fact that it's all not real.
One major piece of a lot of your writing, as I understand, is you're saying that one way to understand some of the problems that we should be attentive to in contemporary AI is a very old heresy called Gnosticism, which is not something that people talk about over dinner very often.
No.
But here you're suggesting, well, we need to be a lot more aware of this idea. So begin to help us with that.
Yeah. So like you said, Gnosticism officially is very ancient heresy. Very early part of Christianity, the Gnostics were influential. But like you said, too, is you can't take a religious item survey and check Gnostic next to religious. I mean, nobody identifies as a Gnostic anymore. But I do think it's one of these heresies that stuck around implicitly in our understanding both of ourselves and also of sort of the cosmos as a whole. So Gnosticism, it's really tricky. There's a lot of moving parts to Gnosticism. There's no such thing as saying, here is the core set of, there isn't like a Gnostic creed, right? You can't say, here's what all Gnostics believe. There's also, so I'm going to take one direction in thinking about Gnosticism. There's other aspects as well. So for instance, one part of that's really important to Gnostics is their emphasis on secret knowledge, right? So there's sort of this kind of cultish quality where a big part of it was you have to kind of know somebody to get the ultimate revealed truth. So we're going to set that aside. That's a really important part of Gnostic traditions as well. What I want to focus on is their de-emphasis of matter. So this is maybe a little too cute, but I really like the slogan, for Gnostics, matter doesn't matter. Right. Again, bordering on too cute, but I think it lands, because the idea is that the most important part of ourselves is not our material side of ourselves, but rather immaterial aspects of ourselves. This is how they also sort of were united roughly in how they understood Christ. There was a lot of range in how they understood the nature of Christ, but they were fairly united in thinking that Christ's humanity was not the thing to emphasize, and that we need to rather focus on the immaterial divine nature of Christ. They have this idea that matter doesn't matter. And I think that idea, especially when it comes to understanding ourselves, is still very much a part of the way that we understand ourselves and think about ourselves today. One example I like here is I like to think about it as the Looney Tunes theory of personal identity. This is a little bit old-timey, but I watched some Looney Tunes as a kid, and it has still stuck around.
You seem too young to watch the Looney Tunes as a kid.
Yeah, I was maybe nostalgic as a little kid or something like that. But you'll see this, and this is in other things too, but in Looney Tunes especially, Sylvester the cat would always die. It was a very kind of morbid show in some ways. And whenever Sylvester would die, there would be this ghost Sylvester that then would rise up out of dead Sylvester and float up to heaven, presumably. And I think that, even if you don't watch Looney Tunes, that understanding of that's who you are has really stuck around, right? So what happens when I die, right, is, I've died, and now sort of this like marshmallowy kind of soul rises up out of me, and that's the real me. And that's who then goes to meet Jesus in heaven, right? Again, maybe people don't have quite that cartoony of a view, but I think roughly a lot of people, especially Christians, especially religious people, think, no, that's the real Joe, is the one that's kind of the immaterial, translucent version of him. And I would argue that's a Gnostic view, because what that's saying is that matter, the body, doesn't matter, right? What really matters is the soul, the immaterial part. So I think that's sort of a version of classic Gnosticism, if not in name, then in belief.
I mean, it's very ironic that what you're describing as contemporary Gnostic belief, a lot of people would say that sounds very spiritual, very devoted, very conservative. But you're saying no. In fact,
I'm saying
that's a very early. It was seen at least as a heresy. 1900 years ago.
And here's the argument for that, Lee, is that Christianity from the beginning was in part radical because of its emphasis on embodiment and resurrection. This is what the early Christians, think about St. Paul on his missionary journeys. He's preaching Christ crucified, yes, but also Christ resurrected, and not resurrected in a spiritual sense. I mean, this is the sort of the Gnostic reading of it would be, Christ is of course resurrected, but it's a spiritual resurrection or something like this. No, right? It's a bodily resurrection. And this is the sort of why this was such a scandalous message, is that, wait, we're talking about like bodies coming back? Yes, it was, right? And this has worked its way into the creeds, right? So the Nicene Creed, we believe in the resurrection of the dead. So resurrection has been absolutely essential to the way Christians have understood not only the nature of Christ and the nature of Christ's resurrection, but also eschatology for ourselves, right? So we look forward to the resurrection, the general resurrection at the end times. What that means then is that for humans and for Christ, matter does matter, right? We aren't fully in heaven. We aren't fully, sort of the end times haven't been fully realized until this resurrection happens at the end of time. Now, there's a lot of room for nuance to think about just how important the body is. Maybe we're basically 90% of the way there when we're our souls hanging out in heaven, and then the general resurrection, we get our bodies back, and it's a good bonus. There's other theories that would say, no, like until you get your body, you're a very diminished version. Like, there's something immaterial about you, and that survives your death. But it's like, it's pretty minimal, right? Like you're really not fully there until you get your body back. So there's room for disagreement among Christians on that question, sort of just how important the body is. But I would argue that from this is like right back to the letters of Paul and, very early ways in which the resurrection is being understood, is that you just can't get rid of this idea that the body is important to humans.
So but the key thing here with regard to AI is that we're presented with this sort of choice here. do we want to reduce what it means to be human to some supposedly immaterial essence, if you will?
Yeah, exactly.
Or do we continue to insist, no, to be human, you must take into account the body and all that the body entails?
Yeah, exactly. And this is where it's a tricky move to make, because clearly AI is material. Right? I mean, it's material in a very different way than we are, but it lives on a server somewhere.
Yeah.
Right? It's not like we've created a immaterial thing. No, it's a fully material thing.
It's at a minimum, it's a vast arrangement of bits and bytes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So maybe it's a mathematical thing, which is another interesting thing to think about. But it's for sure. It's not that we've created another immaterial object. It's that we've created this thing using computer servers. Yeah. So it's not that AIs are immaterial, but rather the point that I want to make in relationship to Gnosticism is that the material nature of an AI is just clearly and obviously different than the material nature of you and me. I mean, you don't even have to run an argument. You just look at a room full of servers, look down, right? Clearly very different material conditions give rise to these kinds of intelligences. One reason why I think that we sometimes get confused talking about the nature of artificial intelligence is that we're bringing this implicit Gnostic understanding to our discussion. And we're saying, yeah, there's very clear material differences between human intelligence and artificial intelligence, but matter doesn't matter. Right? So we don't have to worry about that's not an important, relevant consideration. All we have to look at is functional profiles or what it can do, or sort of the more less tangible aspects of AI. Yeah. And that's the most relevant parts of it. And that's the most relevant parts of us. But I think a Christian anthropology resists that and says, no, it's not, our immaterial part is obviously really important, but our embodied material aspect is also something really crucial. And we can't forget that when we're talking about the nature of humanity in the relationship to artificial intelligence. Yeah. We can't forget our embodied existence.
Okay, so I'm recollecting a interview I did in the last year or so with a very high-profile tech person who is with one of the world's largest companies that we all use every day.
Okay.
At one point I asked him what he thinks. I don't remember exactly what the question, how I put the question, but basically it was something about, how do you think about meaning, or how do you think about what it means to be human, or something like that, some broad question like that. And one of the things that he said in his response is that we must give up as humans the notion that we're special. And so at least one of the things I hear you saying is that, no, one of the ways that we need to hold on to some sort of specialness is by actually holding on to a notion of the importance of the body. But then I can hear somebody coming from his perspective who's saying, yeah, well, there you religious people go in trying to hold on to some sort of superiority, and you just need to let that go because you're not dealing with facts. So how might you reply to that?
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that I don't think you even have to go to religion to make the argument for human distinctiveness lying outside of just our intellects. We have such an intellectually heavy way of approaching anthropology today. And that's partially due to functionalism. I mean, there's a lot of historical stories we could tell here. But when we start thinking about human nature, and we here, I mean both Christians and not, this is sort of culture as a whole, religious people from other traditions, Christians, non-Christians, sort of everyone, we would think, well, if you want to know about humans, who are you going to go to? Go to philosophers, go to psychologists, go to neuroscientists, go to computer programmers maybe. That's really interesting, I think, and indicative of the way that we as a whole have started thinking about what it means to be human, what it means to be intelligent. I think it's really telling that you would very rarely say, want to know what it means to be human? Go talk to an athlete. Go talk to a physical therapist. Go talk to an occupational therapist. Go talk to a ballet dancer. But as soon as you start listing these things off, it becomes very clear, well, of course, someone who dances ballet or is a proficient violinist. We're recording this a week after the Olympics wrapped up, right? It's like you watch Olympic athletes, like clearly they have insight into what it means to be human in a certain, what the human body can do. But we've so reduced human anthropology to abstract, intelligence and the sorts of things that computers can do, that we've just sidelined all these other aspects of human intelligence and, in fact, just being human. I mean, add to the list here, think about relational stuff. You wouldn't think, you want to know what it's like to be human? Go talk to someone with a lot of friends. Go talk to somebody who's a social butterfly. It's like there's these relations.
Talk to the postman.
Talk to the postman.
Talk to the trash man.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think that, again, I think that Christians obviously have something to say about this larger picture of the human and what it means to be created in the image and likeness of God. But I think you don't have to be particularly religious to say that, oh, wait, like those other sides of humanity are really important as well. And it's not just our computational aspects that are the key features of us being human.
Does the exhaustion that we feel from Zoom meetings tell us about something about this?
I think it absolutely does.
So talk about that.
Yeah. So I think that, I mean, I'm sure many people have had this experience, unless you managed to just avoid professional life entirely for the last 10 years, is you get these days, right, where you didn't even have that many meetings, maybe 2 meetings or something, but they were all on Zoom, and you just feel totally drained. You feel like, I can't keep my camera on one more second. I've got to turn this thing off. I think that actually does tell us something about what's being missed in that interaction, right? And it's interesting because if you say, is there anything missing from the words that we're saying? Probably not, right? If you did a transcript of a Zoom call versus an in-person meeting, there might probably be some variation, but you could kind of cover the same territory. You're getting the same facial cues roughly. You're seeing each other. It's kind of relational, maybe even arguably. So what's missing is being present in a room together. This is circling back to when we initially started this, that it's great that we can be present in a room together. And I think what that's cluing you into is that you're not, even on the best Zoom call, you're missing out on a fundamentally human part of engaging with other human beings and a fundamentally human part of engaging with reality. So it's, again, one of these other nudges for us to think about ways in which we're already understanding human nature in overly reductive terms, right? This meeting may as well just be on a Zoom call. And I'm guilty. I've said this as well. You know, I don't want to, I'm not commuting in today. I'd rather, that seems like a big hassle. Let's just do this on Zoom. So I'm just as guilty. But I think that we all too readily think that that's actually an adequate substitute for having a meeting. I'll give you one other example that's maybe a little bit of a pivot. There was a study done it might be a few years old by this point, where they were looking specifically at therapy. And what they did is they had AIs basically do a therapy session and recorded all the transcripts, put those in a pile. Then they had a group of therapists do therapy sessions. It's all IRB approved, I'm sure, but, you know, recorded all the transcripts. I'm sure they got it all anonymized and stuff. Put those in a pile. Then what they did is they mixed up the piles so that you couldn't tell. I mean, obviously the researchers could, but like if you were to look through these, you couldn't tell which were the therapists and which were the AIs.
Yeah.
And then had an independent group of therapists review them for how well they did. And can you guess where this is going? The AIs won. Right. So when they were independently reviewed by therapists, the AIs were thought to be better therapists than the actual inhuman therapists. And initially you might think, oh no, the AIs are winning at something that, you know, you would think sort of the arts therapy, these like this is like deeply human and the AIs are winning. And my response is only if we already have a very reductive understanding of what that interaction is to begin with, right? If what you think a therapy session is producing a transcript, sure, an AI might do that just fine. If what you think a meeting is me communicating information with a colleague, sure, Zoom is just fine for that. If you think what writing a poem is putting words on a page that are kind of creative, sure, an AI can do that. But I think that none of those things are actually that simple. And all of them are much more robust than our initial reductive understanding goes, right? A therapy session is not producing a transcript. A therapy session is two human beings encountering each other in a relational way. And the transcript captures that, but that's not the whole thing. A Zoom meeting is not just me and a colleague relaying information. It's us sharing a space together. And that's why we get Zoom fatigue, is that we realize I'm replicating this in a very reductive way, but not the full picture.
So I didn't know this until I was preparing to have our conversation, but so the Catholic Church decided that you could not do confession over Zoom?
Yeah. So this was a COVID thing, right? So it was over COVID, and all the churches, we can zoom back 5 or 6 years, right? When everything was shut down. And for Catholics, it's an important part of our practice that you're regularly going to confession. And so this comes up, right? As Father Juan, right, is saying he's able to hop on Zoom. He's tech savvy and wants to be able to, we can't do mass right now, but could we do confession? Because that seems to be something that, I can have this conversation over Zoom with Father Juan at the parish, and he's willing to jump on. So this question was raised, does it work, basically? Like, can you get the sacrament over Zoom? And this went all the way to the top. And the Vatican said the right thing. They said, no, it doesn't work. Why? Again, I'm glad we went here, Lee, because it's exactly the sort of phenomenon I was talking about, is that confession is not merely a recitation of one's sins and the absolution of sins, that transcript, right? It's not the words being said. It is an embodied sacrament in which it's crucial that my priest is there in the person of Christ in his body. So it's a very consistent line the church took here, but it basically said, no. And this is, it's in a way, it was a line in the sand, because you would say, well, you're denying someone the ability to engage with their spiritual practices. But it was, I think, for a very good reason, is that if we were to say this was allowable on Zoom, we would have we would be leaning into an overly reductive understanding of what the practice actually was. So that continues to be the teaching, is that you got to be in person.
That's really fascinating.
And it's interesting too, right, is that the substitute was, what you can do is go to Father Juan in the parking lot and yell out your sins from 30 feet away. It's that's fine. It's maybe a little awkward, but as long as you're there in person, it's going to work. And you think that's the substitute? And in one way that's more awkward, and you can't even hear each other.
Certainly more vulnerable.
It's more vulnerable, but it's at least embodied, and you're getting the actual thing that needs to happen.
Right. So what are you making of those who are saying, well, maybe we're just in a big computer simulation anyway, and maybe it can all be boiled down to simulated experience? Yeah.
So I think it's great. I actually think that not for the reasons that, so there's sort of the way you can take this, that sort of the Matrix style argument, right? We're all in a simulation and we can't tell. It's really interesting. I teach that in my philosophy classes. I think it's a great thought experiment. I'm not particularly worried. That doesn't keep me up at night, right? I don't think at midnight as I'm trying to fall asleep, oh no, what if this is just the Matrix, right? Really interesting. I think it tells us a lot about human knowledge and sort of how we confirm human knowledge. I'm not worried about that, Lee. What I do worry about is the ways in which, in a very different way, we are increasingly living in a simulation in ways that we haven't noticed. And here's what I mean by that, is that digital life, and this is an AI thing, but it's also, I think, a digital life thing, increasingly is swapping out more what I call rooted forms of existence. I'm borrowing here from Simone Weil, talks about the importance of rootedness to a human life, and taking out rooted experiences and subtly swapping them in for simulated experiences. I'll give you just a couple of examples. Think about how many runners, or even just people in general, have started counting their steps using Fitbits or Apple Watches. And think about the ways in which, sort of subtly, all of a sudden, it's not just that the Fitbit is counting my steps to ensure my body is healthier, but the goal becomes getting the steps. Right. So, oh no, I only have 9,000 steps today. I got to get up and walk around my kitchen for 20 minutes to make sure I get my steps. What's happened there is that we've sort of subtly left behind rootedness, where the important thing is my body and getting, walking around and being healthy. And the important thing has become the simulation. It's that, no, the thing I'm aiming at is not health, but rather 10,000 steps a day.
Yep.
Well, I'll give you one more. We could talk about this for a long time. This is sort of something new I've been thinking about a lot. The other one I think that's applied to a lot of us, yours truly included, is the way in which our GPS systems have completely made us forget the environment in which we live, right? So I'll find myself sometimes hopping into my car, go to Greg's house, right? Type it into my GPS, and I realize, wait, Greg is a good friend. I've been to his house a dozen times, and I don't know where he lives because I've only ever just turned when my GPS told me to. What's happened is I've swapped out the rooted experience of knowing what the roads are and how to get to Greg's house with a simulated experience. I really have started living my life through the GPS. So this is maybe a roundabout answer to your question, but I don't worry about the everything's a total simulation. What I worry about is that in a much more subtle way, big chunks of our life actually are just simulations now. And the scary part is that we're thinking about those simulations as the real thing. Again, the classic is that the real thing I'm trying to do is get 10,000 steps.
Yeah.
Not just be healthy.
Right. So talk to us some about your kind of Catholic anthropology and how you think about letting that inform alternative ways to think about these things.
Yeah, I mean, so from a Catholic perspective, which I really do understand to be a Christian perspective more broadly, in Catholic circles, it's defined dogmatically. So it's, it is Catholic, but I think that it's available to other Christians as well. Is that the first thing I really like leaning into, which we've already done already, but leaning into embodiment, because I think it's a correction of the kind of thinking that you mentioned earlier, which is if I'm a religious person, I need to believe that the real me is disembodied and immaterial and that's very spiritual. And all of those things are true, but I think that where a lot of believers are at right now, there needs to be this correction of saying, yes, but embodiment is very important as well. And I think that's a very good correction for misguided ways of understanding AI, and also a good correction for misguided and really importantly, problematically misguided ways of understanding ourselves, is sort of correcting us and saying, no, embodiment is actually really important. Once you've made that move, I defend what I call an embodied plus anthropology, which is, yes, you're embodied, but you're not just embodied, right? You also are created with infinite dignity. You're created in the image and likeness of God. And in fact, you are immaterial as well. That's the idea of the soul and the body being foundational to who we are. So again, in Catholic teaching, that's the way the human is defined, is the unity of soul and body. And the embodied plus view is a way of kind of enlivening that in a little different term, saying embodiment is important, but it's never just a materialistic view of the body. It's a human body that is enlivened spiritually. So the Christian is never a materialist. The Christian is always sees spirituality as imbuing matter.
Yeah. So you said there that you think that view is broadly Christian. Who else are you finding who would embrace that view or some analog to that view, that whether they're Christian or not?
Yeah.
Or maybe that's not Christian.
Yeah, no. So I think that there's a lot of work going on right now, part of it in opposition to functionalist views of the human mind, that looks, and this is a lot of times from purely secular scholars, looking at the ways in which embodiment is not just something, our bodies are not just things that we carry out cognitive tasks with, but in fact, embodiment is part of the way that we understand the world and engage with the world. The classic example here, I love to give it because it's a really simple one, is the way that we count on our fingers, right? So if you have I have little kids at home, and they will, even for very simple things, count on their fingers, what's 2 + 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. When that little kid is doing that, it's very much not that they're doing it in their head and then translating that into their fingers. It's that their fingers are helping them count. But of course, we do that too, probably for bigger numbers than 4. But say you're having a dinner party and you say, okay, Jessica's coming over, and then Steve and his wife, and they have 2 kids, and there's, 4 of us. Oh, we've got 9 for dinner, right? So we'll do this sort of thing too. And again, what's happening is that we're not doing the math in our head and then translating it to our hands. It's that our hands are helping us do the cognition. Another example, if you're a musician, you know that you can't think through the scale and then say, and now put it in your hand, right? I play a little bit of amateur guitar, and the scales go horribly if you're overthinking it. The only way to make a scale sound any good is you have to think with your fingers. But I think that's really telling. And it's the sort of line that a lot of even secular philosophers are running right now, which is that we've had this overly overly intellectualized, abstract version of cognition going on for too long, and that we need to return to a view in which cognition itself is something embodied. But again, I would say, so that's sort of the secular viewpoint. The sort of broadly Christian, I would just encourage to go back to the scriptures themselves and just look at how central resurrection is. I mean, St. Paul, basically, I'm going to botch this quote, but it's something, if the resurrection didn't happen, then everything is in vain, right? Or it's foolishness. If the resurrection. 1
Corinthians 15.
Thank you. There's a classic Catholic and Protestant interact. Right. You got the reference. Yeah, but I mean, I don't think you have to say like we have to do this deep dive into Catholic history or different Christian thinkers. It's like just go back and read the Bible. Like resurrection is all over the place. And again, my submission is that emphasis on resurrection doesn't make any sense if you don't have a view that says human bodies are really important.
Yeah. You even have Romans 8 that talks about the materiality of the creation itself that is also longing to be made new.
Yeah, exactly.
So a lot of stuff there. So another thing that you've pointed to coming out of the Catholic social teaching is the preferential option for the poor. How do you see this being tended to or not in the technological developments we're seeing?
Yeah. So the way I like to expand that, so it's sort of one of the basic tenets of Catholic social teaching. Again, preferential options for the poor. Roughly the way that works is that it's coming out specifically of economic and social ways of thinking about things and saying that when we're evaluating economic social policy, the first group of people to think about has to be the poor. So it's not that they're the only group, and it's not that the poor have more dignity than a rich person. I mean, that would be a very strange thing to say as a Christian. It's rather that just as Christ engaged with the poor, and just as, I mean, look at the Beatitudes here. Blessed are the poor, right? Blessed are the meek. That's kind of got to be our starting place. So that looking at new policy, looking at new economics, start with the poor. I like to expand that a little bit and think about preferential option for the vulnerable in general. So that when we're thinking about ethical decision-making, more generally, when we're thinking about our own personal decision-making, really thinking about how those decisions affect the least of these and how those decisions affect people who are vulnerable or marginalized. So I think that's a really important principle, again, coming out of Catholic social teaching, but also one that I take it most Christians would recognize as something that's a deeply just ecumenical Christian way of thinking about ethics. The way that applies to AI, I mean, I think it's a crucial thing for us to be thinking about, and one that I'm maybe not as optimistic about, but I want to be hopeful. There's so much money in the AI space right now, and so much clamoring to have the next best product and the most efficient product and the most productive product that I really do worry that people without resources, people whose jobs are vulnerable to AI takeover, that we're not thinking about them first. So I don't know exactly what the answer is here because I don't lead a major AI company. Most of us don't lead. We're not making policy in Washington. But I mean, maybe thinking about it to the extent that we are thinking through things like policy and economic decision-making, advocating for views that place the poor and vulnerable front and center, and that we're thinking first about things like job loss and how this is going to widen income inequality and things like that. But then again, our sphere of influence there for many of us is fairly limited. Where maybe it can hit the road more is thinking about ways in which new technological adoption in our personal lives can serve or fail to serve those who are less fortunate.
Yeah. Take some of this question about properly attending to realities around us from that kind of social / policy level, and just talk about your own life here in just a moment. How are you trying to practically put practices, habits, commitments into place in your own life individually or as a father, as a professor? What's this looking like for you practically?
Yeah, so I've been thinking about, in my head, I'm calling it the Bartleby option, right? So you might know Herman Melville's classic. If you haven't read Moby Dick, you can start with Bartleby the Scrivener. It's much shorter and it's also great. Never actually read Moby Dick. It's got to be on the list at some point. But Bartleby the Scrivener is this story about this scribe who's working on Wall Street. And all of a sudden, he just starts saying to every task that he's asked to do, I would prefer not to, right? So it's not this sort of loud resistance. It's not, I'm part of a corrupt, he doesn't, get up on any soapbox. He just, his boss asks him to do something and he says, I'd prefer not to. And this goes on and on. And what happens is it's tragic comic. So it's very funny, but Bartleby actually ends up dying at the end. So it doesn't work out well for Bartleby in this case. But what happens around him is that the system doesn't know what to do with him, right? Because they're like, oh, this guy, he's at work, right? He just like won't do anything. Like, what do we do with this guy? And that's the option I'm thinking about in my personal life as a way of quietly resisting not just AI integration with it, but just technological integration more generally, is finding small areas in my life where I can take the Bartleby option and saying, I could do that. And in fact, I don't think as an ethicist, there's anything intrinsically wrong with taking this into my life. But you know what? I'd prefer not to. Couple of examples is I spend a lot of time, way too much time in Chicago traffic. I live in the suburbs and work in the city. So it's a lot of time in traffic. And I've really tried, because of the GPS example, saying, you know what? I could use my GPS and my GPS would let me avoid rush hour traffic a little bit better. But I know where I work. I prefer not to. I'm not going to turn it on. And what does that lead to? I hope that it leads to me being more engaged with the city where I live in. It also comes with losses. I sometimes get stuck in traffic on the Eisenhower that I wouldn't have gotten stuck in because Siri would have let me know, accident, like go around this way. I prefer not to spend my evenings watching TV every night, right? Or scrolling on my phone. So instead, I'm going to just sit around and read a book tonight. In some ways, it sounds kind of silly, but I think that just as a lot of the problems with artificial intelligence and modern tech are cumulative, it's not that there's any one thing that we can point at and say like sometimes there is, but usually, especially when it comes to personal choice, it's not like you've crossed a line, right? This is like you should never do this thing. They're cumulative. It's that we take them on board little by little, and before we know it, our agency's atrophied. We don't know where we live. We don't have real friends because we're only having friends on social media. And before we know it, we sort of left all this humanity behind. Is that I think the Bartleby option gives us a starting point for reclaiming some of that. And even those little steps, just as the negative effects are cumulative, my hope is that the positive effects are cumulative and that these small choices, turning off the GPS, turning off the phone, literally turning off the internet at home. We haven't quite gotten there yet, but I really want to say no Wi-Fi. I'm literally turning it off at 6 p.m. And then no internet after. But things like that. Yeah. To me, I think it's in some ways harder choices because it doesn't feel as drastic, and it's not like if I turn on the TV one night, oh no, I've committed a deep moral wrong. It's like, no, you haven't. But the more times that we're able to take the Bartleby option and just say, no, I'd prefer not to. That hope I'm optimistic that can have a cumulative effect as well.
Well, you're at a minimum, you're asking the question about what kind of life do you want to live?
Exactly.
Right. And the cumulative effect of those kinds of practices is profound upon the direction and the end of a life.
Exactly.
Yeah. Been talking to Joe Vukov, Associate Professor of Philosophy at Loyola University, Chicago. His most recent book is entitled Staying Human in an Era of Artificial Intelligence. Joe, thanks so much for the great conversation.
Thanks so much for having me. This is
lovely.
Great.
Yeah, been lovely to be with you. Thank you so much.
Appreciate it.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carrie Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.